in terms of dengue or other kinds of vector-borne diseases. We specifically were focused on dengue in this model. So let me just walk you through this a little bit. So essentially what happens, of course, is you start with the eggs. We'll just say we have eggs first here. The egg comes first before the mosquito, and then you have the sun, the heat, which represents heat, and the precipitation, the larval stage, the pupal stage, host seeking. Then once they become infectious and blood fed, that feeds into this model of how humans are interacting with the mosquitoes. So it's not just the biological dynamics of what we're doing to affect the mosquitoes, but there's a whole layer of social and population level characteristics that alter the way humans are going to interact with their environment and interact with the mosquitoes. Things as much as increasing poverty, decreasing infrastructure of homes that could lead to greater permeability and more access for those mosquitoes to start feeding on people. So it's very complex, and temperature and precipitation are critical components to many parts of this process. So some of the ways that it's related, this is just the temperature influences on transmission parameters. And you can see that as you increase in temperature, with the red line, the proportion of those that actually are taking a blood meal that become blood fed increases and then sort of levels off. But what's interesting is that it's not that as it gets hotter, every single one of these parameters gets more conducive to dengue transmission. There are some where you start to see thresholds. So the survival of the mosquito, if it gets past 27 degrees Celsius, the survival of the mosquito starts to decline. So we may actually see this complex interaction where you have a shorter time frame for what we call the extrinsic incubation period, which is that time it takes for the mosquito to get infected to when they can infect the next person. So that has a really sort of downward trend across higher temperatures. But things like survival may actually be, there's a sweet spot there, and we may actually get too hot for the mosquitoes to survive. So the Aegypti Aegypti mosquito is particularly problematic because it lives in and around people. So it is not a native desert species. It is not native to Tucson, but it has been here and has been established both in the past, and then it sort of went away for a while, and then reemerged in the 80s was when it was first sort of detected again. And so it's highly adaptable. It is one that they say, oh, it only bites in the afternoon. And then you get reports in Phoenix that, well, it's biting under artificial lights at midnight. So it will change its biting behaviors. It is a survivor, and it will thrive in any minuscule environment that we provide for it, including tiny little amounts of water. Since it does typically bite during the day, bed nets, which are useful for malaria, are not as useful. It really likes to feed on mosquito or on humans. It really preferentially feeds on humans, and it transmits a whole host of different viruses, including dengue, which we are focused on here today. It is everywhere in the Arizona Sonora Desert region. In the most recent emergence was in Yuma, where it started establishing in 2014. It was an anomalous rainfall year, and I believe that increase in precipitation and that slightly cool weather just allowed it to sort of tip and become infested. And that is that now we've had Aegypti Aegypti in Yuma ever since that 2014 sort of emergence event. But what's interesting is that we don't have transmission everywhere. We know that there's not been documented, I'll keep saying that, documented dengue transmission in southern Arizona. We have had some physician surveys where we've talked to physicians, and they don't even have it in their differential, which I think means that there could be pockets of little transmission, locally acquired cases that are occurring, but we just don't pick them up. There's certainly a lot of introduction that occurs. But I want to pitch us a little bit south of the border to do a thought experiment with some investigations that we did, where Nogales, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Mexican cities of Nogales, but a lot of people have argued that, well, it's not in Arizona because our infrastructure is too good. People don't get bitten by mosquitoes. We don't have a lot of mosquitoes around here. It's just the social factors. I think social factors absolutely make a huge difference. But if you look at two of the cities in Mexico where Nogales is arguably probably poorer infrastructure, it has almost no transmission occurring in Nogales. In fact, in 2014, that was the only time that these case numbers were actually locally acquired cases. The rest of the time, those were imported cases that were being indicated there. And there is not really any difference in the number of mosquitoes. So you can look over here on the left and you can see the blue and green-blue bars. And the density of mosquitoes is actually slightly higher in at least 1 year in Nogales as compared to Hermosillo, and then relatively comparable in another year. So we don't think that that's what's happening. So one of the things that we did was we looked at how old these mosquitoes are. And we found that there's actually a fairly big difference in the age structure. So it does appear that in Hermosillo, you actually had these mosquitoes living longer. What does an old mosquito mean? An old mosquito means they've survived long enough to take those blood meals, get infected, and potentially transmit to the next person. So it's also a much shorter incubation period in Hermosillo because it's just so much hotter. So there's a lot more mosquitoes that are surviving past this threshold. When we look in compare it to sort of that median EIP, like I said, it doesn't take quite as long for those mosquitoes to be able to transmit in Hermosillo, only 6 days, 17 days in Nogales, because it's so much cooler in Nogales than it is in Hermosillo. What's interesting is that if you look at these patterns for Tucson, Tucson actually has more mosquitoes and more mosquitoes that survive past that EIP, which we think is probably a social factor component. And we're still looking into how to understand better why Tucson looks like it has excellent conditions for transmission, but we aren't either having reported transmission or we aren't actually having transmission here in Tucson. But clearly this idea of the survival past the EIP appears to be something that's driving transmission differences in Nogales and Hermosillo. So just some modeling experiments that we've looked at. Essentially what our modeling experience, just to sort of boil this kind of complex slide down, is that what we think is going to happen in the future is that it's not that it's going to be always transmission or there's always going to be transmission in the southern Arizona region, but that there's going to be more frequent opportunities for transmission to occur. So the chances that out of 10 years, 1 year will be conducive to transmission is going to increase. So maybe it's going to increase from 1 year in 10 years to 2 years in 10 years, because these big climate driving patterns in terms of El Nino, La Nina will have a big influence on that specific year's potential for transmission. So I also want to mention just briefly some of this other work that we've been doing on microclimates. So that's sort of the big picture, but going down into your own backyard, this is actually work that we've been doing in Phoenix to try and understand why this tropical mosquito is surviving so well in a desert environment. And what we found is that when we look at the correlations between vegetation indices and mosquito density, there is a very strong gradient between how much tree cover you have and the density of Aedes aegypti adults that you have in an area. And one of the reasons I like to mention this is because this has significant implications for some of the interventions that we are planning to mitigate extreme heat in our southern Arizona region. So if you have a large tree planting initiative, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I think extreme heat outweighs our dengue potential right now by, a lot. We have people absolutely dying of extreme heat every year, and having that sort of cool sort of vegetation places to escape to is absolutely critical. But we have to be cognizant of the indirect challenges that may present in terms of increasing habitat suitability for mosquitoes and that potential of changing that. So you can see that this is some work that we're doing looking at shading, and why we think that this may actually have that influence is you can compare bare soil at 124 degrees Fahrenheit to 97 Fahrenheit in the shade. And so you can see that there's a significant difference in sort of these temperature conditions, even in these very, very tiny scales. So we're working on trying to get some additional data collected on really specific landscapes so that we can advise people on what to look for when they're planning their own backyards. So in some, just some general summary statements here, that we know that climate change is going to influence many different health outcomes. The relationships are really complex and are going to vary. I mean, you can't say climate change is going to influence dengue on this global scale. It is all very local, and the dynamics at that local level are very important. And then, of course, the risk is going to be modified by the vulnerability of the populations exposed to the pathogens. If you have poor infrastructure, if you don't have screens on your windows, that's absolutely going to push some populations over the edge. And then, making sure that we have systems in place that can really predict and detect transmission early on so that you can stem and control it. And then mobilization of resources really early in potential outbreaks is also going to be a critical component here. So had a huge team working on many aspects of this work, so I always like to acknowledge them. And that is it. I hope I did okay on my, I didn't do too bad. I didn't do too bad.
High tech. We're going to open it up to questions. I think everyone can unmute themselves, and I think we'll just be nice and ask questions without worrying about the chat. My first comment, I mean, it's just fascinating what both of you have been talking about, but it makes me, about the tree planting, I think it underscores how we don't understand how delicate ecosystems are. That's what we're finding out with climate change, how just some degree of temperature is going to really cause problems. So that's just another fascinating learning experience. So please, anyone just want to start?
I've got a question.
Yes.
I have got friends in Lake Chapala, and all of a sudden now they've got this huge dengue infestation. And so it brings the question, is there like migration patterns?
So where are they again, Shelley?
It's outside of Guadalajara, Lake Chapala.
Yeah. So absolutely, I think there's mobility in both the mosquito populations as well as the human populations. So if you have existing mosquito populations, the humans can introduce the dengue virus. And so if they're in an area where you have a large mobile population, they could actually bring in the virus. There's about 40 to 50% of people are asymptomatic for dengue, which means that you can have healthy carriers into the area. But also mosquitoes can be transported in through the delivery of goods, trucking networks. There's sort of there's several, well, that's more albopictus. Albopictus was actually introduced into Texas through the used tire trade, as well as lucky bamboo that came in from Asia. And so into California, that was an introduction. So they absolutely move, and we help move them around, and we help them move the virus around.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a question for Erika. When we're having flooding events and vector-borne diseases and flooding with the meat industry, we know that's a problem. What about, is that also happening with the vegetarian food supplies, with the vegetable industry, farming,
Yes.
that kind of thing?
Yeah, so there's actually some really good work from another department within our college. Paloma Beamer does some of it, as well as Mark Verhoustrate, but they've partnered with the Yuma Cooperative Extension, and they've done some modeling so Yuma is a big leafy greens producer, and they're the largest producer during the winter months. So I always think it's funny to tell my family in Michigan that if they're getting spinach, it was grown in Arizona, because that's typically where it's coming from. So there is these flooding events that happen, and in Yuma, if you drive around there's some zoning where there's cattle in one area and then romaine fields or spinach in another area, and there should be a barrier to them not being able to use the same water. But there is a huge irrigation that comes from the Colorado River Project that sends water down to Yuma, and they use that same system. And so there's been some events where they've been able to attribute E. coli in the water to contaminated lettuce on the fields, but they haven't been able to identify the source. So that's additional work that they've been doing. What they can see is upfield cattle farms that then have downstream effects from the Colorado River or the irrigation channels that then water produce fields. You can see an increase in the E. coli on the fields. That being said, when it's harvested, it's typically rinsed again and then packaged. So just a reminder here that even if it says it's washed, to just make sure to wash it. The romaine, specifically like romaine hearts, are typically just pulled right off the field and packaged. But it'll say on the package if it's been pre-washed and ready for consumption right away. So something to look for.
Thank you.
A question on the washing, does that pertain to organic too?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So organic produce, it typically uses less pesticides overall. But regardless of where it gets water from, sorry for the dogs in the background if you hear them. Regardless of where it gets watered, you should still wash your produce before consuming it.
Is water's just good enough? You don't have to do anything else for like E. coli, that sort of.
Yeah, so there's little variations for different types of food, and the CDC provides some really good resources that I can put in the chat for which things might need more washing than others. Herbs tend to be more dirty, if you want to say it that way. So like cilantro and dill and those like parsley, that kind of stuff. They typically don't wash it straight off of the field because once they get wet, they tend to wilt, and then it means they're not that great for you to buy once they get in the store. So that's a good one to wash right before you're using it. And a lot of people don't cook those items. A lot of those are fresh ingredients that you add to guacamole or, fish, that kind of thing. So water, just washing it in general is good. I know there was some talk during the pandemic about washing with detergent or vinegar because of the touching that maybe might have happened at the grocery store. And in general, the FDA and the USDA discourage that practice because there's a potential for you to ingest the disinfectant, and that could cause a lot more problems doing it that way instead of just using water.
Right.
So
okay, great.
some things
That's
we've
good.
learned
Great. Thank you. That's good.
through the messaging there. Yeah.
Barbara, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, Casey, can you tell us if there are other these serious infectious disease migrating north and what they are? And also, can you tell us what dengue fever is like for people in case they want to know what's happening to them?
Yeah, so a couple of the other sort of vector-borne diseases that I think we're keeping our eye on, of course, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It's not necessarily changing too much, although we do see that the tropical version of the brown dog tick does seem to be moving northward, which is of concern because there's some shaky evidence that it might be a even more competent vector than the northern subspecies. So that's certainly one to worry about. Triatome also, so the ones that transmit Chagas. We have triatome bugs, but they are really more a threat to allergies right now and anaphylactic shock that some people get. But that is also something that we're really sort of keeping an eye on is that trichotomy. There's also several mosquito-borne diseases in terms of SLE, St. Louis encephalitis has really started to increase in Maricopa County in particular. We do get occasional cases here. West Nile is always an issue for Arizona, particularly in Phoenix and Maricopa County. But those are the primary ones that I would keep an eye on from the vector-borne disease perspective. I'm trying to think. There's some that like plague, which is more in higher altitudes and cooler areas, that we think actually may end up declining because it may become too warm for them. So those are sort of the primary ones that we have here. In terms of dengue and what it's like, I've never had dengue, but I have known people who have had it, and it starts a lot with, if you do get symptoms, you get a high fever, and the dengue means breakbone fever, and so that sort of tells you just how achy everything is. Like your joints are really achy and inflamed, and you have a major headache, and it hurts behind your eyes. You may have red eyes. Some people get a little bit of a rash, and that's sort of with primary dengue, right? And so some people say that those symptoms can last for several weeks, and it can take a while for people to recover. More worrisome is that there are 4 serotypes. There's actually 5, but one's mostly in primates. 4 serotypes, and if you get infected with one serotype, it actually makes it more likely to get a severe hemorrhagic manifestation of dengue if you get a second infection. So you may have some immunity to, so they're very simply named dengue 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so say I get infected with dengue 1, if I get in and I develop some sort of partial immunity to dengue 1, and then if the mosquito has dengue 1 again, then, you know, I'm probably going to be more likely to be asymptomatic. But if it bites me and it has dengue 3, then my risk of getting a more severe illness actually increase, because there is this antibody dependent enhancement where your body sort of recognizes it, so it ramps it up, and you get a sort of overexpression of inflammation, and that can be, that's when you actually usually would get the potential deaths. Death rate is actually quite low for dengue, which is the good news. So I think of dengue hemorrhagic fevers, the case fatality rate is somewhere between 2 and 4%, depending on where you are, much lower in high income countries, higher in low income countries where there's not good treatment.
How
Yes,
do we,
Shelley.
oh, sorry.
How do you what?
I was going to say, how do we find out about infections and that sort of thing? It's on the Pima County Public Health website. Does it have a list of what, you know, maybe there's a E. coli breakout or anything like that? How do we know?
Yeah, so if there's an outbreak that that the county has detected or that the state has detected, they usually do some sort of an announcement, both to the healthcare facilities, but also to the public. So there should be messaging through the health departments. Unfortunately, a lot of times it seems like the channels that they disseminate their messaging through doesn't reach a broad audience. They do have, I mean, I don't know if you follow social media, but they have Facebook, they have Twitter accounts and those kinds of things where they do often give timely messaging about outbreaks that may be occurring. And so you can, you know, friend them or whatever to get that information, but they should do public messaging. I don't know, Erika, are there any other things you can think of?
Yeah, I put a link in the chat box, but you can also just Google CDC outbreaks and you can see all the current ones that are happening. Obviously, there's a lot of COVID-19 happening, but there's a panel on the left that says US. The most notable one that's going on right now is a salmonella in onions, which we haven't seen in a while. It's a huge multi-state outbreak. But they've been able to contain it so that the onions that you buy now should be totally fine. Should be off the shelves. So.
Question for Casey. This is a two-parter. Is how is dengue diagnosed? I assume it's a blood test, like 1 or 2 days. And then the second part is, how easily do the doctors or medical personnel recognize that that's what you have?
Yeah, so if you know that you've been in an area and you know you've been bitten and you develop a high fever, you know, and retroorbital pain is sort of a classic. So that eye pain is a classic sort of indication too. Then, you know, you can tell the doctor that you suspect that it could be dengue if you've been in a dengue endemic area. So just raising it to their attention. It is a blood test, so so right around when you have fever onset is the best time to actually get the virus test. And so that is a blood draw. It's also a blood draw to do the serological tests. And what they do at the serological tests is so your viral tests, your viral load sort of increases and then declines after about, I don't know, a week or so. And so then it's really hard to detect it by a viral test, but they can do paired serological tests where they take an initial test to look at your antibody levels, but you have to take the paired convalescent serum later to show that you've had this significant change in your antibody response. That is what indicates that you've had a recent infection. So the viral tests, you know, should be pretty available in most hospital centers, et cetera. They may have to, I mean, you just get the blood draw. Sonora Quest, I believe, does have testing available, but it may take a while. So you may actually recover before you get your test result is one of the big challenges.
So if I didn't tell the doctor or medical personnel that I'd been in this area, and I'm just, say it's somebody down the street has the symptoms, then what I hear is the doctor may not recognize it, correct?
Yeah, so there's been a big education push so the paper that we wrote, we did that investigation in 2014, 2015, I think. And I actually did that study with people from the Arizona Department of Health Services. So they were very aware that a lot of physicians didn't have this in their differential. So they have done quite a bit of work to try and promote that information to healthcare providers. But you can, you know, if you suspect that you may have it, you know, bring it up to your doctor. I think that's one of the best things to do, and just see if they can take a test for you. I think if you know that there's dengue activity in the area where you live and you start to develop a fever, you're absolutely well within your right to request that test.
I had a question about mosquitoes. So we have at our house a pretty bad mosquito problem in the warmer months. We do have 3 large trees on one side of the property. And anyway, I was motivated to see if there are non-chemical ways to mitigate. And so we actually, in doing some research, ended up getting a bat box because they're supposed to be prolific consumers of mosquitoes. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to attract any bats, probably because we don't have a water source very close. But I guess my question is, other suggestions in terms of non-chemical mitigation approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one, of course, is to find any water sources that you might have and try to cover them, eliminate them, etc. Right? So I don't know if you have any ponds or well, actually ponds wouldn't be dengue, but if you have fountains or if you have a sprinkler manifold or if you have water harvesting barrels, all of those you want to check and make sure that they're either airtight and they don't let mosquitoes in, or you can treat them with this thing called Mosquito Dunks. And that is actually a bacteria, and it's called Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis. And so you can just buy that at Home Depot. It's actually non-toxic, safe for pets. Essentially, the larvae eat the BTI and it explodes the larvae. So it's actually a non-toxic biological intervention. There are some other things that are being tried. We want to do some experiments with what's called the GAT traps. And these are lethal ovi traps, which are like a black bucket. And then you just spray canola oil on the inside of it. And you put some water and maybe some rabbit food or something in the bottom. And that serves as an attractant to the mosquito because it thinks it's going to lay its eggs there. It's a nice black place where they can lay their eggs. But when they get inside, that oil coats their wings and they get stuck. And that's also a non-chemical intervention. And that's been less tested as a control measure. We do have some preliminary data from UMA that indicates that if you have, I think it's a density of 5 per acre. So I don't know how big your plot is, but if you put those out, they're pretty cheap. They're like $20 or so. And just every week you'd want to make sure that the water was full and to wipe down the inside, spray more canola oil on, and that can be a potential change as well. The bats is such a cool idea. I wish it would work. Unfortunately, bats are nocturnal, and the Aegypti Aegypti and the Culex mosquitoes are usually more active. They do have that sort of funky activity at night sometimes, but since they're mostly in that sort of afternoon period, there might not be great overlap between the activity of the bats and the activity of the mosquitoes. So that's just one added component. The other might be to look for larvivorous fish. So don't use Gambusia because they're non-native, but you can use the top minnow. So the Pima County Health Department actually has a program where if you have any sort of permanent water bodies, and they'll eat the Culex too, you can get these little fish. They're native fish. So if they escape into the environment, it's no big deal. And so you can just put those little fish into your water harvesting barrel or whatever, and they will eat the larvae. So those are some ideas that I have that might work for you.
What was the name of the product you initially?
Yeah, they're called Mosquito Dunks.
Dunks?
Okay. Yeah, they call them Mosquito Dunks. I'll see if I can find the link on Home Depot or whatever, so you can at least see what the packaging looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I have another question. Are there vaccines for any of these diseases that are migrating northward? I did a lot of traveling in my younger life, and I have vaccines for all kinds of diseases, infectious diseases, going to Africa and Asia. But so we don't tend to have those otherwise in this country. But are there any vaccines for dengue or any of the others?
Well, so there's a new vaccine for dengue, Dengvaxia. It's a bit of a challenging vaccine. So you want to make sure that when you want to get a dengue test before you actually get the vaccine. So it's also not incredibly effective. It's only licensed in the United States for Puerto Rico. And you want to have people who it's actually, I think in Puerto Rico, only approved for children. And you have to have a lab confirmed previous dengue infection. And you need to be living in a dengue endemic area. So it's because of this antibody dependent enhancement issue, where if you get the vaccine and you've never been exposed to dengue, it actually increases your risk of getting severe disease. And so there was like a big, huge problem with it in the Philippines. So that one, not so much. Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever doesn't have one. West Nile only has it for horses. There's none for RMSF or Chagas either. There is some phase 4 trials for malaria. There's Japanese encephalitis, but most of the mosquito-borne diseases don't have vaccines. Yellow fever, but we don't have much yellow fever risk. Hopefully that won't crop its ugly head here.
What about valley fever? I had valley fever when I was a kid here, and then I heard that that you can get it again after 50 years, which is, not convenient. It's true.
No, I don't. Do you know much about that one, Erica?
No, I know that there's been lots of pushes to do valley fever in pets. So they actually have a phase 3 trial right now for a vaccine for dogs, which
Wow.
looks really promising. So that would be helpful. It hasn't been successful in humans. It doesn't seem to confer immunity. So yeah, I think at least for now, doxycycline, which is the treatment for it, is much cheaper than it used to be because it's just a generic instead of a specific one. So at least we have that.
Do cats get it?
I don't know. Do you know, Casey?
I
think it's
don't,
mostly
for some
dogs.
reason, I don't think they're as susceptible. No, I mean,
Yeah.
I hear of dogs all the time, but not so much cats.
Casey, I was curious if you have noticed any decrease in mosquito-borne illness with COVID since people were staying inside more.
Yeah, it seems like there hasn't been much transmission in Arizona this year, but it's hard to know because we've also had such a dry year. I think that the mosquito density is lower. I do think some people are doing well, at least in the springtime. There were more people doing outdoor activity than usual because everything was closed except for the parks. I mean, oh my goodness, I don't know if you all went hiking at any point in time when everything was. Wow, it was not a pleasant experience. It was way too crowded for my taste.
Yeah, Tumamoc was like 3 lanes or something. Chris, did you have a question?
I don't, but I do have some dunks.
Oh, great.
Did it work? Did it work?
Well, yeah, it did. I went out to my, I have a little waterfall pond, and I went out there the other day because I don't go out there that much in the summer, honestly. And I noticed these little things, black things swimming around. And of course, I've never seen them before, but I know what that is. So my first thing was to dump pond Clorox stuff in there.
Oh, yeah.
It helped a little bit. And then I Googled, because you got to Google everything. And it said apple cider vinegar. And dang if that didn't work until I got
really?
the house. It wasn't the permanent thing, but it was much better than the Clorox.
Huh.
So
well, and it's safer too, right? Than Clorox.
Yeah.
So that
well, I
seems
do
like
a
a
little
winner.
Clorox. It's not Clorox, it's for ponds.
I see. Okay.
So it's like for swimming pool kind of thing.
Okay.
I
mean, you could get some fish in there, Kristen, and it would potentially be more
well,
of a
when you said that, I was thinking about it, but I drain it periodically, like once a week. So to keep it clean, so that wouldn't work. Yeah. But Karen, what did I have this year in my front waterfall?
You had the Colorado River toads.
It was
so cool.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, I said to her, don't worry about it. That's very exciting to have those.
Yeah.
It was. I was getting a leak. It was all going out into the street. So I called the irrigation guy again. It's costing me a fortune, and he came and they looked, and here was this frog sitting on top of the valve, causing it to leak out. I said, well, we didn't touch it.
It was special for you to do that.
That's
to have that.
funny.
And Barbara had the other ones. What was spadefoot?
The spadefoot toad, yeah.
What's that?
It lives in our riverbeds, I guess. And when the monsoons come, they all come out and look for mates. And I was in my backyard and heard this squawking noise, and I thought it was a bird. And then this little tiny hoat. There were pictures. There's still pictures in the Star online. It's about the size of a silver dollar, but with beautiful patterns on its back. And when it croaks, this big airbag comes out from its neck, makes a very loud squawking noise, and was hopping around in my backyard.
All right.
Cool.
I'd never seen anything like it, but they're out there.
Silver dollars. Remember the day when I could have collected all I wanted?
Yeah,
Another lost opportunity.
that's right. They are no more, aren't they?
Yeah, no more.
Well, I guess we haven't mentioned this, and that's good, but in terms of COVID-19, are we starting to plateau in any way? Can you give us a little hint about that?
Yeah, it looks like it. It looks like some of the things that we sort of put into place with the mask mandates and things like that are actually working. We are cautiously optimistic that we're plateauing and sort of starting on that downslope. PIMA metrics are starting to look decent. So my hope is that it will continue to go in the right direction with schools. You know, I think the schools, at least here in Tucson area, are going to be online for a little bit. But once they reopen, I think we're going to have to keep our eye on those metrics really closely. U of A as well. I've been involved in their reentry planning, and so we finally got the president to agree to metrics-driven sort of controls instead of date-driven controls. So that was really exciting, and I think it'll help reduce that potential impact that reopening the university might have on Tucson transmission as well.
Can you explain what that difference is that you just mentioned?
So metrics driven means that you would look at what our level of transmission in the community is, what the cases look like in the university, whether or not we have good public health capacity and hospital capacity. So actually looking at those numbers to decide, you know, how big are our classes going to be? How are we going to hold public events? What are we going to do? Instead of saying, you know, August 31st, we're going to start with classes that are size 30 or less. September 7th, we're going to start offering ones that are 100 or more. So instead of saying, based upon the calendar, we're going to make these decisions, it's based upon the data, we're going to make these decisions.
And the resources.
Yep.
Why wouldn't, yeah, I mean, I don't know why that wouldn't just be the first thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
But I don't.
Silly girl.
I'm gonna not get myself in trouble.
I see that football is out. Pac-12 is out. So that's good.
Yep.
But not good for the university. Isn't that a thing, you know?
It's a big moneymaker. Yeah, that's definitely a loss. I mean, it is. I mean, my heart's breaking for my institution. It's the money sort of loss is going to be pretty huge. And, you know, we're doing a lot of furloughs. So hopefully it won't mean a lot of layoffs for people, because of course there's huge public health impacts when people lose their jobs too. So it's a real tricky balance.
It's a big one. And then you have all these young people that are, you know, physically fit and at their prime and ready to, you know, this is when they can do it, and they're being deprived of it.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot. It's a very complex issue. I do not envy the president's sort of role right now in having to
been
grapple
doing
with
a really
all those
good job
decisions.
though. That's what my impression is. That I mean, isn't he the one that's on MSNBC and CNN a bit?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. He's often on there. Mm-hmm.
Casey, a little bit off topic. Is that purchase of that online school going to go through, you think?
Oh boy, that is a big sticking point. That is really controversial. I think it will. I mean, you know, they had enough people already writing letters saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this.
So Emma
and they
has
still, bye, Kristen.
my dog has to go. Bye.
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 So I think the decision has been made. I think it's really tricky, because even for our College of Public Health, that institution has an MPH program online. So, you know, that we're afraid of those programs getting conflated, and you know, that was a 36% graduation rate for that institution. That is staggeringly bad. So you know, there's been a hugely significant pushback. But I don't know, I just don't know how much that's going to make a difference.
Thank you.
Well, are there more questions? I want to make sure if there are a few more questions, please go ahead, but I want to make sure our speakers are okay with a question or two. If there is a question or two. If not, I want to thank you both, Casey and Erika. It was fascinating. It was really nice of you to drop in. And maybe you can drop out in a minute because it's getting even more windy and it looks like it might rain. So let's go out.
Yay, I'm going to go
Let's
outside.
Talk about
our
climate change
fingers.
and it rains.
Give us something, please. Something. Thank you, everyone. It was terrific
Thank
meeting
you.
both of
Very
you.
nice.
Thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.